When my brother Akiva was born, the youngest of the three of us siblings, my mom gave a short speech at his bris. She shared that the births of my sister and me each represented some of what life with us has been like so far. My birth was very dramatic, and 7-year-old me was too. My sister Mia's birth was very calm, and 5-year-old her turned out to be pretty calm too. And the birth of my brother, who had just come into the world 8 days earlier, was beautiful. And my mom said she hoped life with him would be beautiful as well. It's a good story. And this story, which has been repeated over and over in my family as a silly way to tell about the days we were each born, painted a picture of who my sister and I were at ages 7 and 5 in comparison to one another and how our family saw us. I was the loud, over-the-top, dramatic one, and my sister Mia was the calm, sweet, and mellow one. I was putting on musicals in my basement and forcing all of the cousins to participate, and my sister was quietly playing with her Polly Pockets. For those of you who have siblings, you may have your own version of this. The sporty one and the artistic one, the sensitive one and the tough one, the older, bossy one and the younger one who follows them around. Maybe you were best friends with your sibling, maybe you fought, or maybe your relationships were complicated in all sorts of other ways. Perhaps you have a friend or cousin you were compared to growing up, or someone you know that you feel compared to now. It makes sense that we try to put people in boxes, categorizations, and tropes. It helps us make sense of the world, but it can be hard to be compared to one another. For my sister and I, we've often acknowledged that these categorizations of our personalities as children don't paint the full picture of who we are and who we are to each other. In the Torah, siblings often have complicated relationships, to say the least. The book of Genesis is filled with pair after pair of sibling rivals and sibling pairs who are compared to one another in detrimental ways. By the time we arrive at Rachel and Leah in this week's Torah portion, we've already met Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, and Jacob and Esau. These relationships include one killing the other, one of the siblings being banished, one stealing the other's birthright, and in all of these cases, one being favored by their parents or by God. And in the end, only one prevails. Rachel and Leah, the sisters in this week's Parsha, are also compared to one another. First, by appearance. Rachel, the younger, is first described as shapely and beautiful, while Leah, the older sister, is described as having weary eyes. When our patriarch Jacob comes to Haran, he meets Rachel and is immediately struck by her beauty and wants to marry her. Rachel and Leah's father, Laban, agrees to allow Jacob to marry Rachel if he first works for Laban for 7 years. Well, when the 7 years come to an end, Laban tricks Jacob by instead marrying him to Leah, the older daughter, and then Jacob must work for an additional 7 years to eventually marry Rachel. Throughout Leah's marriage to Jacob, she is unloved and hopes over and over without success that birthing sons will cause Jacob to love her. You might be familiar with that part of the story. But the text also gives us some clues to get to know these characters in a deeper way. In addition to her beauty, we learn that Rachel is a shepherdess and the only woman in the Torah known to be one. She's active, athletic, out in public, doing a job that is traditionally done by men, which I think is pretty impressive. Leah is well known for being described as having a naim rakot, weak eyes, in contrast to Rachel's beauty. But another translation for rakot could be sensitive. Leah seems to be deeply connected to God, praising God for the births of her children and praying to be loved. Ibn Ezra, the medieval commentator, writes that Leah's einaim rakot were perhaps missing an aleph and should be arukot, meaning long. He interpreted this to mean that Leah could see into the future and envision what would be coming. So perhaps Leah is a more sensitive, intuitive, spiritual person in comparison to her more outgoing younger sister. While these two foremothers are compared to each other throughout their story and in the process of getting married, their relationship turns out to be different than the pairs of brothers which came before them. The Talmud tells a story of Rachel looking out for her sister. When Jacob and Rachel meet, Rachel suspects that her father Laban is deceitful and might swap in Leah to marry Jacob instead of her. When she tells Jacob about her suspicion, he teaches her special signals for her to use on the wedding day to prove to him that she's the one marrying him, even if still covered by a veil. But what does Rachel do? In the end, she teaches these signals to her sister so that Leah wouldn't be publicly embarrassed when their father swaps her in to marry Jacob. Rachel loved Jacob and wanted to marry him, but she cared more for protecting her sister. Years later, Leah protects Rachel too. At this point in the story, Leah already had 6 sons with Jacob. Their handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, had each had 2 sons, and Rachel had not yet had any children. Then Leah becomes pregnant again. Another Talmudic story teaches that with Leah's Einaim Arukot, an ability to tell the future, she had the knowledge that there would be 12 sons of Jacob and 12 tribes. And that meant there would only be 2 more that would be born. Wanting her sister Rachel to also be a mother of 2 sons, 2 tribes, Leah prayed for her baby to be a girl. God listened to her prayers and gave Leah a daughter, Dinah, meaning judgment. Rachel eventually gives birth to 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, the last 2 tribes. Having a son in these times was the ideal, and the thing that Leah had hoped would make Jacob love her, but she gave up having another son to allow her sister to mother 2 tribes. The others in the story did everything possible to pit Leah and Rachel against each other, to compare them, to favor one over the other, but our tradition insists that these sisters supported each other instead. And while the biblical story gives us brief introductions to these characters which try to put them into boxes, they're each more complex and expansive than they seem. They go beyond their beauty or lack of beauty, and even beyond being the more outgoing, active one and the more sensitive one. Each sister brings strength, sensitivity, and care in her own way. While our tradition only regards Isaac and Jacob as our patriarchs and not their siblings Ishmael and Esau, Rachel and Leah are both our matriarchs. We claim both as our foremothers, as people to admire and whose stories we tell. Our tradition holds them with their differences, embracing 2 different personalities, 2 different styles of leadership, and different forms of strength as sisters and mothers. For each of us, may we bring our unique, full selves into our communities, and may we, like Rachel and Leah, approach each of our differences and comparisons with more love. Shabbat Shalom.